9. The Full Moon Ride. It was a full moon night, and the streets were empty. Rachel had just left her friend's house after a night of watching horror movies, and she was eager to get home. She hailed a taxi on the corner of the street, and a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The driver, a tall, lanky man with a scruffy beard, smiled at her in the rearview mirror. "Where can I take you tonight?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Rachel gave him her address, and the driver nodded, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. As they drove through the deserted streets, Rachel noticed that the driver seemed to be taking a strange route. They were going down alleys and side streets that Rachel had never seen before. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think you're going the wrong way. My house is just a few blocks from here." The driver chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart," he said. "I know these streets like the back of my hand. I'll get you home in no time." But as they continued to drive, Rachel began to feel a growing sense of unease. The streets seemed to be getting progressively darker and more deserted, and the driver seemed to be enjoying the ride a little too much. Suddenly, the driver slammed on the brakes, and the taxi skidded to a stop. Rachel's heart was racing as she looked around, trying to get her bearings. They were in a deserted alleyway, surrounded by tall buildings that seemed to loom over them like sentinels. The driver turned around, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light. "We're here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Rachel's heart was racing as she realized that she was trapped. The driver's eyes seemed to be boring into her soul, and she knew that she had to get out of the taxi, no matter what. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. The driver laughed, a cold, mirthless sound, and Rachel knew that she was doomed. As the full moon hung low in the sky, Rachel screamed and screamed, but her cries were drowned out by the sound of the driver's maniacal laughter. The taxi seemed to disappear into the darkness, leaving behind only the faint scent of blood and the echoes of Rachel's terrified screams. The next morning, the police found Rachel's phone on the sidewalk, the screen cracked and broken. But Rachel was never seen again, and the taxi driver was never found. Some say that on full moon nights you can still hear Rachel's screams echoing through the deserted streets, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike. The Joker's playground, the old abandoned park, had stood vacant for decades, its once vibrant colors faded to a dull gray. The locals avoided it, whispering tales of strange occurrences and unexplained sightings. But for a group of adventurous CLG students, the park's notorious reputation was a siren's call. The group of 5 friends, all in their early 20s, had been planning this expedition for weeks. They arrived at the park on a crisp autumn afternoon, eager to explore the abandoned playground. As they stepped through the rusty entrance gates, a chill ran down their spines. "This place is seriously creepy," whispered Emily, her eyes scanning the overgrown landscape. "Come on, it's just a park," replied Matt, his grin faltering for a moment. "What's the worst that could happen?" The group laughed, but their merriment was short-lived. As they ventured deeper into the park, they stumbled upon a decrepit merry-go-round. The ride's colorful horses seemed to leer at them, their glassy eyes glinting in the fading light. Suddenly, a faint, maniacal laughter echoed through the park. The students exchanged nervous glances. "What was that?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling. Probably just the wind, suggested Jack, but his tone was unconvincing. As they continued to explore, they discovered a series of disturbing graffiti scrawled across the park's walls. The images depicted a twisted, clown-like figure with a grotesque grin. "This is seriously messed up," muttered Emily, her eyes welling up with tears. The group decided to leave, but as they turned to exit the park, they realized they were lost. The entrance gates were nowhere to be seen, and the trees seemed to have shifted, trapping them in a maze of twisted branches. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing than before. The students spun around, desperate to locate the source of the sound. That's when they saw him, the Joker, perched atop a crumbling slide, his eyes blazing with madness. His grin stretched across his face like a grotesque, painted-on smile. "Welcome to my playground," he cackled, his voice like a rusty gate. "You'll never leave." The students froze, paralyzed with fear. The Joker began to laugh, the sound growing louder and more intense until it became a deafening cacophony. As the students stumbled backward, tripping over each other in their desperation to escape, the Joker vanished into thin air. The laughter ceased, and an oppressive silence fell over the park. The students stumbled through the darkness, desperate to find their way out. But as they emerged from the park, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The world outside seemed different. The sky was a deep, bloody red, and the trees seemed to twist and writhe like living serpents. The students stumbled through the streets, searching for a way back to reality. But the Joker's laughter echoed through their minds, a constant reminder that they were trapped in his twisted playground, forever doomed to play his sadistic games. As the days passed, the students began to disappear, one by one. The authorities searched for them, but they were never found. The old abandoned park remained standing, a haunted monument to the Joker's twisted reign. And when the wind blew through its empty playground, the sound of maniacal laughter echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder that the Joker's playground was always open for business. The fear of my own shadow. As a child, Emily had always been fascinated by her shadow. She would dance in the sunlight, watching as her dark silhouette mimicked her every move. But as she grew older, her fascination turned to fear. It started with small things. Emily would catch glimpses of her shadow out of the corner of her eye, and she would feel a shiver run down her spine. She would try to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as time went on, the fear grew. Emily began to avoid mirrors, afraid of seeing her own shadow staring back at her. She would walk down the street, trying to avoid the long shadows that stretched out behind her. She even started to wear bright colors, hoping to distract herself from the dark shape that followed her everywhere. But no matter what she did, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her shadow was watching her. She would feel its presence in the room, even when she was alone. She would see it out of the corner of her eye, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. One night, Emily woke up to find her shadow standing in the corner of her room. It was tall and imposing, its presence seeming to fill the entire space. Emily tried to scream, but her voice was frozen in her throat. As she watched, her shadow began to move closer. It reached out a dark, shadowy hand and touched Emily's face. She felt a chill run down her spine as her shadow whispered a single word in her ear. "Mine." Emily was consumed by a sense of terror. She knew that she had to get away from her shadow, but she didn't know how. She tried to run, but her shadow was always one step ahead. It followed her everywhere, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, Emily became a recluse. She stopped leaving her house, afraid of what her shadow might do. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what her shadow might do while she was unconscious. And then, one day, Emily disappeared. Her friends and family searched for her, but she was never found. Some say that she was consumed by her own shadow, that it finally caught up with her and dragged her down into the darkness. Others say that Emily is still out there, living in a world of eternal darkness, tormented by the shadow that haunts her every step. But one thing is certain. Emily's fear of her own shadow ultimately destroyed her. She was consumed by her own terror, and she was never seen again. The next time you see your own shadow, remember Emily's story. Remember the terror that she felt and the destruction that it wrought. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice before fearing your own shadow. 7. The old oster tree. The old Victorian house had been in the family for generations. It was a beautiful, sprawling structure with a large backyard that was perfect for children to play in. But there was one thing about the backyard that made it less than perfect: the old oster tree. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches twisted and tangled in a way that seemed almost malevolent. The tree's trunk was thick and sturdy, but it was covered in strange, glowing symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As a child, Emily had always been fascinated by the old oster tree. She would spend hours playing in its shadow, climbing its branches and exploring the strange symbols that covered its trunk. But as she grew older, Emily began to feel a sense of unease whenever she was near the tree. It started with small things. Emily would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and see that there was no one there. She would hear strange noises like whispers or creaks that seemed to come from the tree itself, and she would feel a creeping sense of dread, as if the tree was watching her, waiting for her to make a wrong move. As the years went by, Emily's fear of the old oster tree only grew. She would avoid the backyard, afraid of what might happen if she went near the tree. She would try to convince herself that she was being silly, that the tree was just a harmless old thing. But deep down, she knew that she was right to be afraid. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of scratching at her window. She got out of bed and approached the window, and that was when she saw it. The old oster tree, its branches reaching up towards her window like skeletal fingers. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had to get away from the tree, but she was paralyzed with fear. And then, as she watched, the tree's branches began to move, twisting and writhing like snakes. Suddenly, the window exploded inward, showering Emily with shards of glass. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet as she desperately tried to get away from the tree. As she fell, Emily saw the old oster tree looming over her, its branches reaching out to claim her. And then everything went black. The next morning, Emily's parents found her lying on the floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. She was cold to the touch, and her eyes were frozen in a permanent scream. The old oster tree was still standing in the backyard, its branches twisted and tangled in a way that seemed almost malevolent. And as the sun rose over the house, the tree's symbols began to glow, pulsing with a life of their own. The police investigation into Emily's death was inconclusive, but the family knew the truth. The old ostrich tree had claimed another victim, and as they moved out of the house, they couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets was the tree hiding? 4. The mirror's reflection. As soon as Emily moved into her new apartment, she noticed something strange. The mirror in her bedroom seemed to be reflecting an image that wasn't quite right. At first, Emily thought it was just her imagination. But as the days went by, she began to notice that the reflection in the mirror was changing. It was subtle at first, just a slight difference in the way her eyes looked or the shape of her mouth. But as time went on, the changes became more and more pronounced. One night, Emily woke up to find that the reflection in the mirror was no longer her own. It was a dark, twisted version of herself, with eyes that glowed like embers and skin that seemed to be stretched too tight. Emily was horrified. She tried to turn away, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The reflection seemed to be pulling her in, drawing her closer and closer, until she felt like she was being sucked into the glass. As the days went by, Emily became more and more entranced by the mirror. She would spend hours staring at her reflection, watching as it changed and twisted into something grotesque. And then, one night, Emily disappeared. The police found her apartment empty, the mirror still hanging on the wall. But when they looked into the glass, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Emily's reflection was still there, staring back at them with eyes that glowed like embers. But it was no longer alone. There were other reflections in the mirror now, reflections that seemed to be watching and waiting. The police knew then that they had stumbled into something much bigger than they had ever imagined. The mirror was a portal to some dark and ancient world, a world that was hungry for souls. And Emily was just the beginning. 8. The Forest of No Return. The CLG students had been planning their forest trip for weeks. They were all excited to get out of the city and spend some time in nature. The group consisted of 5 friends: Alex, Emma, Jack, Sarah, and Matt. They packed their bags, loaded up their gear, and set off early in the morning. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker. The group had to push aside branches and fight their way through thorny vines. They had been walking for hours, but they were determined to reach their destination, a secluded campsite deep in the forest. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they stumbled upon a strange cave. The entrance was a massive stone mouth, yawning open like a hungry beast. The group hesitated, unsure of what to do. "I don't know, guys," Emma said, her voice trembling. "This cave looks really creepy." "Come on, it'll be fun," Alex said, his eyes shining with excitement. "We can explore it and see what's inside." The group reluctantly agreed to enter the cave. As they stepped inside, the darkness enveloped them like a shroud. They fumbled for their flashlights and turned them on, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cave was massive, with towering ceilings and narrow passageways. The group wandered deeper into the cave, their footsteps echoing off the walls. They stumbled upon ancient symbols etched into the stone and strange artifacts that seemed to belong to a long-forgotten civilization. As they explored the cave, they began to feel a creeping sense of unease. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive. They started to hear strange noises, the sound of scuttling insects, the creaking of ancient wooden beams, and the faint whisper of voices. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get out of here." But it was too late. The group had wandered too deep into the cave, and they were lost. They stumbled through the darkness, desperate to find a way out. But every passageway they took led them deeper into the cave, further and further from the entrance. As the hours passed, the group's fear turned to panic. They were trapped, and they knew it. They started to hear the voices more clearly, whispering strange and terrifying things in their ears. One by one, the group members began to vanish. At first, the others thought they had simply wandered off, but as the hours passed, they realized that something was terribly wrong. In the end, only one person was left: Matt. He stumbled through the darkness, desperate to find a way out. But as he turned a corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The rest of the group was standing in front of him, their eyes black as coal, their skin gray and decaying. They were surrounded by a halo of flickering candles, and their voices were whispering a single, terrifying phrase: "Welcome to our home." Matt tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The group began to move towards him, their eyes fixed on him with an unspeakable hunger. And as Matt screamed, the cave was plunged into darkness, the sound of his terror echoing off the walls forever. The small town of Ravenswood had always been a quiet, unremarkable place. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. Life in Ravenswood was predictable, almost monotonous, until the night the stranger dog appeared. From that moment on, nothing was ever the same. It was a warm, balmy evening in mid-July when the dog first arrived. Children were playing in the streets, the air was filled with the sound of cicadas, and the town's main street was bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. The dog wandered into town as if it belonged there, moving with a confidence that was at odds with its scruffy, mangy appearance. Its coat was patchy and dull, its ribs protruded slightly, and its eyes were a strange, piercing yellow that seemed to glow faintly even in daylight. At first, the townsfolk gave it a wide berth. Stray dogs weren't uncommon, but there was something unsettling about this one. It didn't bark, growl, or even wag its tail. It simply roamed the streets, its gaze sweeping over the town like it was taking stock of everything. It seemed harmless enough, and over the next few days, people grew accustomed to its presence. The dog would linger outside the diner, sit quietly by the playground, and patrol the edges of town as if it were a self-appointed guardian. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, an undercurrent of unease began to ripple through Ravenswood. Strange things started happening, small at first, almost imperceptible. People reported hearing scratching sounds at their windows late at night, even on the second floor. Others spoke of faint whining noises that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Some claimed to catch glimpses of the dog in the shadows, its eyes glowing unnaturally bright in the darkness. The first truly alarming incident occurred at the home of Martha and Bill Hendricks, an elderly couple who lived near the edge of town. One stormy night, Martha was awoken by the sound of scratching at the back door. Thinking it might be the stray dog seeking shelter, she cautiously opened the door. What she saw made her blood run cold. The dog was standing there, drenched from the rain, but it wasn't the same dog she'd seen around town. Its eyes glowed brighter than ever, and its body seemed to shimmer and ripple as though it wasn't entirely solid. Before she could react, the dog let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through her very soul. Martha slammed the door and bolted it, but she and Bill were plagued by nightmares for weeks afterward. Word of the incident spread quickly, and the town's unease grew. People began avoiding the dog altogether, crossing the street to keep their distance if they saw it. Some suggested calling animal control, but others were reluctant, fearing that the dog was more than just an ordinary animal. Whispers of superstition began to circulate. Some said the dog was a harbinger of doom, a spirit sent to punish the town for some unknown transgression. Others believed it was a guardian protecting the town from an even greater evil lurking in the shadows. The turning point came on the night of the full moon. A group of teenagers, emboldened by a mix of curiosity and bravado, decided to follow the dog and see where it went. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they trailed the dog as it wandered through the town, eventually leading them to an abandoned house on the outskirts. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, and its yard overgrown with weeds. The dog slipped through a gap in the fence and disappeared inside. The teenagers hesitated, but eventually followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside the house was heavy and oppressive, carrying a faint, metallic smell that made their stomachs churn. They found the dog in a corner of the living room, its back to them. As they approached, the dog turned to face them, and what they saw would haunt them forever. The dog's body began to change, its form twisting and contorting in impossible ways. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its fur fell away in patches, and its eyes burned with a fiery intensity. The air around it seemed to ripple and hum with an unearthly energy. The teenagers froze, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their legs refused to obey. With a bone-chilling growl, the creature lunged at them. The teenagers screamed and fled, stumbling over each other in their desperation to escape. They burst out of the house and didn't stop running until they were back in the safety of the town square. When they told their story, their terror was palpable, and no one doubted their account, not after what happened next.